Hello, welcome to Holistically Speaking. I'm Morella DeVoe, your host. Our mission at Holistically Speaking is to be the avenue through which the voices of holistic health reach you at the time you need it most. And as you know, we sometimes have naturopaths, we sometimes have acupuncturists, we sometimes have spiritual healers, and today we're talking about communication that gets results. And my guest today is Lisa Bridge. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.
I am very excited to have Lisa because many of you might remember that Lisa used to be the host of the show. So welcome back.
It's great to be here.
In
this chair.
In that chair. So I'm really excited to have you here and talk about communication.
Thanks.
So I thought we could get started and kind of get it out of the way in a way because there's so much that we could talk about. But given that the show is Holistically Speaking, and we usually talk about healing.
Yes.
Let's talk about and set the stage for how is communication relevant to healing?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect place to start because people do think of, back pain or some kind of other physical ailment as being really what drives them to acupuncture or whatever, or, herbalist or something. But, in my experience, having a difficult issue with a boss, a sister, a father, any kind of relationship like that that's contentious or that causes you stress, a spouse, the obvious one, that you don't know how to deal with or, that might require confrontation, which most people, avoid like the plague. And, those kinds of things can also make you sick. They can make you physically sick. They obviously affect your emotions and your ability to focus on work. They can really have the same fallout, if you will, as a physical injury.
Yeah.
And they do. They cause people, a lot of stress.
Yeah. That's a really good point that, I think of communications like, obviously, emotional health obviously can be helped with good communication, spiritual health, mental health, being at peace and all of that. But your physical health obviously can be affected.
I think a lot of problems come from people making assumptions or leaving things unsaid that really should be said.
Yeah.
And that goes for confronting or addressing a problem or an issue, all the way to just complimenting somebody and giving them some love and something that makes them feel good. All of that.
So how did you get to working in communications and helping people work with their communications?
Good question, too.
Get better?
It's really morphed. I've been coaching for probably, I want to say 13 years now, since 2001. And it started with, I worked exclusively with ADHD adults in the workplace. And then I found a lot of them were in positions in sales. And then once I started working with a lot of them in sales, communication was there every single time. It was always there when I was working with them personally because there was issues with spouses a lot. But then once I started working with salespeople and realized, these people don't have a customer service department or, somebody that's going to handle their direct communications with clients, whether it's trying to get people initially to talk to you or whether it's troubleshooting or damage control. Always these communication things kept coming up. And I just found it more and more and more. And then I started working with, there was one person I was working with who I was working on business communication, and we're talking, and he's having this. He starts to cry,
oh my gosh.
And he's so distracted because he had this falling out with his childhood friend, and the guy won't speak to him, and he's really upset about it. They've been friends since they were 10 years old. He's almost 60, and
their business partners.
This big rift, and he's asking me to help him with business communication, but he can't even focus on it
because he's
Case
so
in point,
distraught.
because he's so upset about this. And so we had this whole conversation about it, and ended up. I helped him write a letter because he couldn't get the guy to talk to him. So we sat down, we talked the whole thing through, and wrote this beautiful letter to his friend, and it worked. So there was. It happens that, it's just the communication is everywhere. The communications issues just are through everything. Whether you're trying to, and someone else I was working with on business and, had an issue because he didn't feel like he could put as much time into his business because he he felt like the home responsibilities were weighing more heavily on him than his wife.
Yeah.
So he couldn't even put in the time, and we were trying to work on business stuff, and all this other stuff was bleeding through because he didn't know how to have a conversation with her about it.
Oh, wow.
Didn't know how, and every time he would try to talk to her, it would be a fight.
So he would have the pressure on him was so intense.
Yes.
That he couldn't really function
Yes.
so well. It was so
Exactly.
distressing.
Exactly.
So then what I hear you saying is that you straddle this world where you might be working with an executive on his effective communication skills, but then realizing that maybe they need better communication everywhere.
And I think it happens, it seems to come up with me, that people just sort of start spilling stuff. So, which is great. I mean, it's really, I feel honored that they would trust me and feel, I think that I just have, I understand how people think and what motivates them to do the things they do. So I provide a perspective. People just naturally open up and we start working on whatever comes up. And so that's sort of how it's morphed into this communication thread, just weaves through everything. I try to do this and it always comes back to how do you communicate this to get what you want.
So why resist it? Let's just focus on communication alone.
Right. Yeah.
And what you're saying also speaks to a great amount of trust that you must create for people where they feel they can just open up and,
I think that's part of the healing is that because I just sort of know, sometimes when people can't tell me how they feel about something, I just know because I have this ability of being able to put myself in their shoes. So I can say things like, wow, you must feel this or you must feel that, or sometimes I find the words for them and usually I hit the nail on the head, and so they really feel like it's healing in some way because they not only do they feel heard, but they feel I really understand the hurt or the frustration or the difficulty that they're going through.
Yeah.
So it facilitates the process a lot.
That's so huge. What you're saying is the absence of a good emotional vocabulary in many cases it hampers people's ability to even experience their emotions.
It does.
So you probably become a phenomenal facilitator.
It's a good point. I mean, my dad was a taught psychology, personal group communications, and those kinds of things, and was very much one of those people who loves everybody and helps everybody. And my mom was an English lit professor, so I'm sort of this hybrid of using my words to, understanding what people are going through and using my words to express it. And people are grateful for it. If they don't have, many people didn't have a model of parents, who had a wonderful relationship and who could demonstrate, how do you handle this conflict? How do you address these things that are tough and things that are hard to say to people?
Right.
So
I want to come back to that in a second, but there was something that popped to mind as you were talking about effective communications and the workplace and all of that. And I'm wondering if you're seeing any complexity arising from modern communications like email and now social media and texting, and what is that doing for communications? Do you see any of that?
Yeah, I think one of the things right off the bat is that it's so generational that some young people that I work with don't really get that they, if there's somebody that they're trying to communicate with who's 60, then maybe the method of texting isn't, you have to consider your audience, and vice versa. So I think that's one of the first things is that you have to understand that those people aren't going to be comfortable with that necessarily, and you might have to pick up the phone or send an email. And I always tell people, ask, don't guess. Say, what is your preferred method of communication? If you're getting into a project or a relationship of any kind, say, how would you like me to contact you? And let that person, especially if they're a client, where they're driving things, then you need to say, would you prefer that I email you or phone you or text you? What works for you? And I've told people, there are some people who don't want to text, but if you're dealing with someone who's young, who's hired you or whatever it is, you need to be able to, flip back and forth and know what's the right, because there's no sense in making people upset if you can, if you don't know, just ask, and then you're never wrong.
Yeah, and definitely the style and preferred avenue can go a really long way to the message actually being received.
Yes. And people always maybe don't have the common sense, which maybe isn't so common,
Right.
to know that, when regardless of who the audience is, if it's a big, long, involved thing, sometimes it's better just pick up the phone.
Right.
Especially if you're not a good writer, that's another thing. If you're not really clear and you're not going to take the time to edit
Right.
and check carefully what you're saying, everyone knows, probably has a story of sending an email that had something in it that they didn't intend.
Right.
The way that it was taken.
Yeah.
So I think if there's something, there's a time to write and there's a time to just have a conversation.
Right.
And some people don't maybe give it as much thought as they should sometimes.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how you work with people. I'm wondering, so the person who's watching at home and they might be struggling with something, tell me about the different kind of I guess scenarios perhaps that you help people with. Is it presentations, is it oral, is it written, is it all of the above?
Yeah, it is all of the above, and I thank goodness, because it keeps me from getting bored. Excuse me. I had someone in the last month ask me to help her write a letter to a judge because her son was facing some significant jail time.
Oh, wow.
And she was just distraught about it.
Yeah.
And, we had to have a conversation because it's a fine, I don't write these things for people. We need to have a really in-depth conversation. I can help them write it. But we had a long conversation about, how did she feel about it? What did she want to say? And I said, you need to draft this. And she drafted it. And I went over it, and we had some long conversations about this. And in fact, I talked with her yesterday, and she said it wasn't just the letter. It was that I pushed her to actually think about how she felt about what her son had done. And it pushed her to have a conversation with him that she may not have otherwise had. So she said, I could have just taken it, almost all the way and been okay with, okay, I wrote the letter and that's it. But she had some issues with him. She had some anger and so it allowed her, the whole conversation allowed her to really take it all the way to the end and not just avoid that last little bit where a lot of times people will say to me, okay, I'm good with that. Now next. And a lot of times I have to say, well, can we go back for just a minute?
Yeah.
Because they're so quick to move on. And she said that to me. She said, I wouldn't have gone that last little bit.
Right.
And her relationship is so much better with him now because she's had that conversation and it's been really clear.
That's wonderful.
So that was really interesting and different.
Yeah.
And very powerful. I mean, I just
For
found
sure.
myself in tears when she called and said, the outcome of what happened. It just really,
Yeah.
and I know how much it meant to her 'cause she couldn't have found those words necessarily on her own. So it was really,
For sure.
and I felt really honored because that's, there was a lot of shame and guilt and stuff on her part with that. So I felt really, it was really, I was honored that she felt she could be honest with me and have that conversation with me.
So do you also do like the role playing? So if this isn't going to be a written conversation, a written communication, if somebody's needing to have a difficult conversation with their boss or a partner, or do you coach them through that?
I do. I mean, a lot of things. I first of all, I want to know a little bit about who they need to address. Because I'm a big picture person and I can usually see more than the person who's stuck in the middle of it. Probably because I'm, my emotions are a bit detached. Yeah. Even though my empathy gets the best of me sometimes. But so I want to know as much as I can about the situation because garbage in, garbage out. If I'm not getting the whole story, and then maybe we're not crafting the right approach. Yeah. But so who are you dealing with? Because you have to adapt your delivery. You can say anything. Yeah. I feel you can say anything to anybody if you say it with love. Yeah. And they'll hear you. But it's very important, how you do that. So I talk about, first of all, I want that person to get really clear about what they feel and what they want to get out of the conversation. Okay, what is the problem? Why do you think you're feeling that way about it? What do you want to get out of this conversation? Be really clear about it. And then I might say, so how do you think that person is feeling? Why do you think they did that or said that? What do you think you really, that's one of the biggest keys that I think prevents people from doing this on their own a lot, is that you have to be able to put yourself in the other person's shoes.
Right.
You have to. You've got to imagine, guess, play some scenarios out and say, what if he's thinking this? I mean, a lot of times I have to say, well, what if he's thinking this? Or what if he said that because, you know, and a lot of times people haven't thought of that.
Yeah.
And understanding is really the key to having this peaceful, you know, compassionate communication that's going to get results.
Right.
So try to imagine where that person is coming from and what their perspective is and what they might think.
Right.
And then I always say, ask them before you even launch into whatever it is that you have to say. Find out first where they're coming from and what their take on the situation is, because otherwise you might just waste your time, put your foot in it, whatever it is you're going to do. But I think that, you know, like many, you know, platitudes that we hear, but we don't really take them seriously in our own lives.
Right.
Seek first to understand and then be understood is so important, because the person that you have an issue with could be on a totally different page, totally different book, you know? So finding that out first is critical, I think, before you jump in.
Absolutely. Asking questions can be so powerful and lead to resolution without, you know, having to, you know, hash everything out again.
Absolutely.
So what I'm hearing you say, just to kind of recap your steps, if I, so you're saying, you know, and I'm, for people at home thinking, okay, I'm having this difficult conversation, and what do I need to do? So, like, looking at the scenario, how are they asking themselves what's the context, how they're feeling about it, you know, what are their feelings about the situation, what they're expecting to
the outcome,
achieve from the conversation, and then kind of switching places. How's the other person possibly feeling? What could they be thinking? Is that kind of your methodology?
And then I think the thing is, here's the other big key, is once you ask, shut up and listen.
Exactly.
Put a sock in your mouth, literally, if you have to. But this person could be potentially, you know, going off on you, blaming you, yelling at you. And it's kind of critical that you just listen. Don't rebut anything. Don't defend yourself. Don't accuse them of something. You know, you get into that and you're going nowhere.
Right.
It's just not, you know, there's not going to be any.
Right.
So you have to listen and hear them out, because that's part, I mean, if you walk into this situation and somebody's anger, you know, and distraught level is way up here, and you listen to them before you even start this conversation or your piece, you've knocked it down substantially, because they feel heard.
Right.
You know, and acknowledge, okay, I heard you saying this, it sounds like this. I mean, it doesn't have to be quite that touchy-feely if you're not comfortable with that kind of language, but you know, you need to listen to them and really hear what they're saying. And when I say listen, I don't mean wait for a break in the conversation so you can jump in and say what you want to say, but really hear them. Yeah.
Well, and what's coming, the words that are floating in my head is listen to their truth. Because I think oftentimes, do you find, this is my perception of what can often happen, is when there's disagreement or when there's difficulty, there's often blaming and either blaming or trying to, what I wanted to say is trying to prove the other person wrong. So they're both trying to prove to each other that the other are wrong.
Absolutely.
Instead of assuming, like, even if you just ask yourself, well, what if what they're about to say is true for them?
Yeah.
You know, it's
their perspective.
It's their perspective.
And that is their truth.
Yeah.
I think, just to add something to that, I think that's also partly why it's important to figure out what you want to get from the conversation before you start, because that could check you a bit. Once you start, you know, hearing that, you can remind yourself. You can remind yourself what the purpose is here, which isn't to be right.
Exactly.
Or it might be, but then, you know, don't bother.
Yeah. And, you know, oftentimes also, here we're going into a deeper level, when you ask someone to think about what's the outcome that they want from the conversation or the communication, do they often come back with, well, I want them to do what I want, or I want them, you know, well, what if that's not going to happen? So is the outcome, do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, and I think I coach people on, you know, getting what they want. with their words and their presentation, and that's okay to want to get what you want.
Right.
But you also have to consider the fact that you might not.
Exactly.
You know, is it the right thing? You know, that's a whole nother, I mean, it is deeper, and it sort of floats a line, which you have to be careful of in business, you know, an ethical line here.
Right.
But you can go after what you want, and you can craft words that are going to convince people. I mean, lawyers do it every day, right? I mean, you need to craft your language but you also have to consider, what does this other person want?
Right.
Is there a common ground here? Is there something that's, I mean, running roughshod over people and get it, I mean, I always say, you can get what you want from people, and they can hand it to you on a silver platter and say, here, my dear, I'm happy to give this to you. Or you can get what you want, and people are walking away calling you names.
Yeah.
Okay, there's two different ways to get what you want. And I've talked to kids about that too.
Right.
You know, listen, you know, there's a way to do this with some finesse.
Yeah.
And have people happy to give you what you're asking for.
Right. Right. Yeah. The more words are floating through my head. This is so thought-provoking. That I guess it's all about acknowledging that you can get your needs met, but the other person might also have needs of their own, or they always do.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, can you get those needs to reconcile? And sometimes you can, and sometimes you can't, right?
Yes. And I think it's important to look at the big picture and get out of just your piece. I think that's really the hardest thing for people, is they don't see anything beyond their own piece, their own feelings, their own desires. They don't see beyond that, and it's really hard to connect if that's your only viewpoint.
Yeah. So how about the realm of personal relationships? You've already told us a little bit, but do people come to you specifically because they say, I can't communicate with my partner or a parent or a sibling?
Yeah, they do.
And is your approach similar, or is it different in any way? What do you find there?
I think mostly what I have to do is coach them, get them to see, what is this person dealing with? Why might they be acting that way? You know, and I ask a lot of questions.
Right.
You know, can you see how this might look to them? Yeah. Can you imagine if they only have this piece? You have all of this information, they only have this one little piece. Can you imagine how that might look to them? And I do have to, you know, you mentioned role play. I mean, I do have to sometimes say, you know, this is what this person is seeing and hearing. I have to tell them, you know, this is the piece that they know. This is all that you've given them, or this is all that they are aware of. Yeah. So can you understand how they might be thinking this or doing that? Right. So, and usually once they have that understanding, they say, oh yeah, you know, and they get it. Right. But it's, I really have to sort of open that, lead that, and ask those questions to get them to really see, you know, this is what, somebody was telling me, you know, I keep trying to have this conversation with my husband, and every single time it's an argument. And I don't know how I just said, well, because he's thinking this, and he's thinking this, and he's thinking this, and he's thinking this. So if you say this, or if you approach it this way, see what happens. And it was a completely different
outcome.
Yeah. I mean, she'd been trying to have this conversation for years, and it was always a fight. Right. And, you know, she just wasn't considering his side. Yeah. And it's easy for me to say that because I'm not in it.
Because you're not married to him.
Right. And I may have killed him. Who knows? Right. But, you know, it's hard for the person who's in it to see that.
So we have about another 5 minutes.
Wow.
Time flies by.
It
so
does.
I am interested in talking about compassionate communication, but if that's not something you want to talk about, if there's something else that you feel like, you know what, this is really juicy and I want to share this with viewers.
Juicy.
Well, then maybe not. So
nothing comes to it. Keep asking me stuff, and nothing comes to mind right now.
So I just wanted to be sure that we
that I didn't miss a good story that I wanted to share.
Right.
Thank you.
So earlier, before we started the show, You mentioned that you help people with compassionate communication.
Yeah.
And that's a huge word for me. And so I'd love to understand, what do you mean by that? And I would love for our viewers to.
I think it's really about, it's peace.
Mm-hmm.
It's about having these, I mean, we all have to live with and work with and interact with people that, we don't get along with all the time, we have issues with, we have problems with, and I think really at the heart of it is understanding that that person is human being and has all of the same worries, fears.
They have a heart too.
Yeah, I mean, so keeping it human and having compassion and understanding for their position is really the key to everything. And my daughter said something to me once, I think she was about 15, and she said, Mom, we all have something in common with everybody, every single person, and if we can't be bothered to figure out what that is, we could lose out on a really great
This is true.
connection, friend, lover, partner, something, right? And so we have this commonality and this human bond, that if you can just hone in on that and see that and understand that most people are doing stuff out of their own pain. They're not trying to hurt you. They're not, lashing out purposely to make you feel terrible. They don't know any other way to do it. They don't know another way to get your attention, or they don't know another way to resolve something that's causing a problem. Whether they didn't have an example or they had bad examples. They don't know.
So let's be sure to show, before we run out of time, sorry to...
No, that's okay.
Let's be sure to show your resources and how people might contact you if they are needing support.
Yeah, great.
So these are some of the books that you are recommending?
I love that. The Art of Communication by Thich Nhat Hanh, and he's a Vietnamese monk. I love all of his stuff, but The Art of Communication in particular is a wonderful, wonderful book, and he talks about using these principles, with warring countries. I mean, this is stuff, you can use on any scale, these skills. Many people know how to win friends and influence people. It's an old classic, but it's still great. My dad used to teach that course when I was a kid, and it's just good stuff.
Phenomenal book.
Yeah, it is. And the 5 Love Languages, I love this book because it's very practical, and it's more the personal realm. I think I mentioned before, there's a lot of books, if you want to specifically target negotiation, communication, or sales, there's umpteen different choices of different books.
Oh, that's my timer saying we're out of time. So we have about another minute.
And my website is down, but my contact information is there, even if you go there, and my numbers. And
whatwouldlisasay.com, and your email is whatwouldlisasay@gmail.com.
That's it.
So
that's it. Nobody forgets it.
No, what would Lisa say? Yeah, very easy. So thank you, Lisa, for joining me.
It was a pleasure.
Coming back. This was
really
so fun.
pleasure.
Of course, time flied. And I hope you learned a thing or two, and check out those books and get some help from Lisa if you're needing some coaching or some help writing some letters. Phenomenal resource. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you next time.